Welcome to Middle East Dialogues, a series of conversations with leading scholars and writers, produced by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. Your host for this episode is Nader Hashemi, the director of the center and an associate professor at the University of Denver's Josef Korbel School of International Studies. Our guest for this episode is Marc Lynch, professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He served from 2009 to 2015 as director of the Institute for Middle East Studies. He is also the founder and director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His publications include The New Arab Wars, Anarchy and Uprising in the Middle East, The Arab Uprising, The Unfinished Revolutions of the New Middle East, and Voices of the New Arab Public, Iraq, Al Jazeera, and Middle East Politics Today.
Well, Marc, thanks for joining us on our regular sort of series on Middle East conversations today.
Well, thank you for having me here.
So we are on the eve of a new administration coming into power. And I'm wondering from your vantage point in Washington, D.C., whether you've been able to detect any sort of coherent narrative or strategy that might shape Donald Trump's new foreign policy toward the Middle East.
Well, I think it would be a stretch to find anything that resembles either coherence or a strategy right now. And I think part of that is that Trump himself has been fairly inconsistent in many of his policy statements and tweets. And many of the people who he has appointed to top positions disagree with the positions that he has taken. And most of the more lower level positions have yet to be announced or filled. And so I think there's real questions about what his policies will actually be. That said, I mean, there are a few things that I think he was quite consistent about over the course of the campaign. And you have to believe that these are actually things that he believes. So, for example, he believes that the Iran nuclear agreement is the worst deal ever negotiated, and he's promised to tear it up on day one, and that has been a major theme. Now, my expectation, and the expectation I think of most people in the area, is that he won't actually do that. That for him, this is a bargaining position, and that he hopes to be able to use this to pressure Iran in order to to better behavior, more concessions, basically to at least tacitly renegotiate the terms of the deal, and probably to ramp up confrontation with Iran around the region. And that's actually not a terrible strategy, except that it would require a certain level of finesse, which it doesn't appear the administration is likely to have.
Right.
But I mean, I think we're fairly certain that he's going to change the approach on Iran. There's a much harder line on Islam, on what he calls radical Islam, which tends to push against a lot of the analytical progress that the U.S. government has made over the last decade. So he and his cabinet appointees, they talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and nonviolent groups in the same breath that they talk about Al-Qaeda. They see this large, undifferentiated mass of Islamist terrorism that they want to be the main focus of U.S. foreign policy in the region. What that actually means in practice, hard to say. They haven't really given many details. As far as the war against ISIS goes, it seems likely that it's going to be pretty much the exact same thing that Obama's been doing, just with different language. Then on things like Israel, for example, he's staked out a line very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that seems to be a political position that he's likely to sustain. Although every U.S. president starts off saying they're going to be friendly with Israel, and then they end up getting in fights. Right. And so that is likely to change. And then you have this. One of the most interesting things, I think, is this highly transactional understanding of alliances. This notion that our allies aren't carrying their share of the burden and wanting to rethink, go back to the base principles. So you've heard him questioning NATO, you've heard him questioning the European Union, and so I think for our allies in the Gulf, even for Israel, they have to be very nervous about that, about the idea that he might actually begin questioning these long-standing alliances. But then on the flip side of that, he's made it pretty clear that he doesn't care about democracy or human rights. And so most Arab leaders are very happy that they're not going to have to face any real pressure on democratization or human rights. So he wants to double down on alliances, for example, with Egypt's President al-Sisi, leaders in the Gulf. So again, that'll be a change, at least in rhetorical tone. And then the final thing is that he has been quite hostile to intervention in Syria, which is going to be interesting because all of his major appointees are in favor of intervention in Syria. And so that'll be a real something that we'll have to wait and see if he sticks to his position on staying out of Syria.
Right. So outside of the circles that you and I sort of spend most of our time in, outside Middle East studies, political science, the view that the Trump foreign policy team have been articulating with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood, that they're basically indistinguishable from ISIS and al-Qaeda, is a very popular view. And I suspect very soon in the Trump administration there's going to be an attempt to try and officially declare the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And that view has a lot of popular, I think, support outside of the circles that we know, people who know the topic, in other words. What would be the political fallout or consequences for the United States if they were to go down that road?
Well, so there's been this attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been cultivated on the extreme right for quite some time. And they've built up this whole network of conspiracy theories linking Hillary Clinton to the Muslim Brotherhood and Obama to the Muslim Brotherhood. And so there's a fertile base for that in Trump's political base. There's also pressure and support for this idea of declaring the Brotherhood a terrorist organization from U.S. allies in the Gulf, who have done exactly that, and from Egypt, and there's actually support for that among many of these allies. In terms of the kind of legislation that seems to be coming, there's been a bill introduced in the Senate by Ted Cruz. There's other bills that are out there. And what they're doing is they're calling, not for the immediate designation, but they're calling on the State Department to be mandated to conduct a review. Now, something very similar happened, as you know, in the United Kingdom. And the result of that investigation, led by Sir John Jenkins, was basically to say that the Muslim Brotherhood has problematic there's problematic issues there, but they're not a terrorist organization, which was quite disappointing to the sponsors of that bill, but ultimately ended up with something close to the status quo. So that's kind of where things stand right now. In terms of the impact of it, I think the impact at the international level really would be almost on a case-by-case basis. And so even the Saudis, who sponsored and supported the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, they work with them quite closely in Yemen and in the Syrian opposition. It's really, and in Bahrain for that matter. So it's not like a blanket thing, it's more a case-by-case thing. I think the biggest impact would probably be inside the United States, where using the Muslim Brotherhood as the designation is in many ways a way to go at many Muslim American organizations which might or might not have affiliations with the Muslim Brotherhood, but can be easily labeled as such. And so many Muslim American organizations, Muslim student organizations, are really very worried about what this will do to the entire infrastructure of Muslim American civil society. And, you know, the level of sophistication that you see among the sponsors of this kind of legislation isn't reassuring. The idea that they would be able to make fine-grained distinctions between this organization and that organization and how linked they truly are to the Muslim Brotherhood, it doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence.
Politically speaking, you've made an argument in terms of the role that the Muslim Brotherhood has played historically in Egypt and in other Arab countries where the Muslim Brotherhood has a presence. You've made an argument that challenges the popular narrative that the Muslim Brotherhood has actually played a moderating role in terms of the internal politics of Arab societies, because you argue that they have performed the role of a firewall against extremism. What do you mean by that?
So it's important to be careful about what exactly this means. So the argument is not that they're a moderating force in the sense of promoting moderation. It's that they act as a firewall against individuals and groups moving towards violent extremism, and that is a critical distinction. So the argument that I've made is that the Muslim Brotherhood is extremely effective at kind of promoting a view of Islam and society, which by the standards of secular society seems quite extreme, right? They want people to become more religious. They have very conservative social views. They have a whole set of ideas about the role of religion in public life, which are not they're not secular. I mean, this is an Islamist organization. But they also have traditionally had this very well-established organization, which is well embedded within mainstream society. In places like Egypt and Jordan, they have a public presence, representation in the parliament, offices you can visit. They're frequently quoted in the media. They're a public presence, and they also have a very powerful organizational presence. And so they have a very strong self-interest in there not being the emergence of more radical competitors. So if groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State try and come in and recruit people and bring them towards violence, the Muslim Brotherhood on the ground, present in mosques, present in Islamic spaces, are the best positioned to keep them out, to hold their people within the organization and to prevent incursions by the more extremist groups and violent groups, because they know that the Brotherhood knows that they will be the first to suffer. If there's acts of terrorism, they will be the target of the response. So they had both an ideological interest and also a very real self-interest in preventing it. But the problem right now is that, and I just published a Carnegie endowment paper about this, is that the Muslim Brotherhood today is not what it was, especially in Egypt. The organization has been completely shattered. The senior leadership is almost all either in prison or dead. Large ranks of the cadres have been driven into exile, imprisoned, or killed. And the public presence is largely gone. The clinics and the social services have been confiscated, expropriated by the government, and there's public propaganda campaigns against them. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is no longer in the position that it was for decades. And so within the Brotherhood itself, there's deep divides now. You have youth movements that want to turn to violence, who believe that the political path has completely failed. You have others who want to just retreat back into religious proselytizing and get out of politics completely. And the organization is no longer able to control its own ideology or practice. And then meanwhile, you have had the emergence of increasingly violent groups, which might be offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood or might not be. Nobody really knows. It's very murky and hazy. But I don't think there's any question that there's a direct correlation between the shattering of the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization and the rise of violence justified in the name of Islam in Egypt. And so, many people, including in an exchange on his blog, the Egyptian foreign minister complained about this argument about them being a firewall against violence. And but when I look at it, what's happening in Egypt right now seems like very strong confirmation of this argument.
So final question about your book, which we're promoting here. At the end of the book, you sort of, very last paragraph, articulate almost a grand strategy for what U.S. policy toward the Arab Islamic world should be, and you sort of state that, as the United States sort of withdraws from the region, it should sort of focus on supporting not the authoritarian regimes that we have historically been allied with, but really focusing on the democratic aspirations of the peoples of the region. And so I think that's a notion that most people would find non-controversial. But the really difficult question comes in the policy details. What does that actually mean? So if I were to pose a question, what does that prescription that you give at the end of the book mean concretely in terms of U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia today, for example? What could the United States be doing, should it be doing, to follow the prescription that you sort of articulate at the end of your book?
Well, the problem is that I actually think, and this is one of the other points I tried to articulate, is that the U.S., there's very little that it can do. That people in Washington, people in the U.S. foreign policy community, they tend to radically overestimate the ability of the United States to control and shape events in the region. And so I actually think that what I tend to push for is kind of scaling back, this what I call the right sizing of the U.S. presence in the region. I think democracy would be a good thing for the democracy in the Middle East. I think would be a very difficult thing for the United States in the short term because it would empower groups that largely disagree with American policy objectives and threaten American client regimes, but in the long term would make for a much healthier relationship. And so I generally would think that the U.S. should be supporting that as a long-term goal. But the reality is that there's very little the U.S. can do about that. I think we've seen the limits of U.S. democracy promotion over the last 10 years. And I think that at the current moment, when you have these resurgent autocratic regimes and the kind of shattered societies, the prospects for democracy right now are exceedingly low. It's just not going to happen. What I think is happening in Washington now, you see it in Trump, I think you would have seen it with Hillary Clinton as well, is this wanting to go back to working with the old autocratic allies, basically saying the Arab Spring was a failure, and let's just go back to the old ways of doing business. And I think that's where we're going to go. And it's going to fail. Because when I look at the Middle East right now, I don't see any of these regimes as being stable. I mean, I think they're far more unstable than they were in 2010 before the Arab Spring. And that includes Saudi Arabia, it includes Egypt. Obviously, it includes the failed and shattered states like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. But I look at a Saudi Arabia, I look at an Egypt, Jordan, many of the states in North Africa, and I think they're profoundly unstable. The economies are getting worse and worse. The governments are more repressive. Oil prices are down. They're increasingly unable to deliver on anything positive for their people, and none of the aspirations of the Arab Spring have been realized. So I think the U.S. is going to double down on basically working with local strongmen, and then they're going to pretend to be surprised when it all blows up in their face in a few years.
And so where does that leave us, though? I mean, the prognosis and the prescription here is for more doom and gloom. You mentioned in the book specifically, I think rightly, that the next uprising is going to be much more violent, angry, sectarian than what we saw in 2011. So isn't that just a prescription for ongoing, turmoil for decades to come? I
think ongoing turmoil in the Middle East is likely what's going to happen. And the ability of the U.S. to shape that is very, very low, unfortunately. And I think that the U.S., there are things that the U.S. could do and should do and probably won't do. I think that, for example, ending the war in Yemen would be a major contribution, but that's something the Saudis and the Emiratis are unwilling to do. I think that the Iran nuclear deal was a major step in the right direction, but it's largely been emptied of its transformational power by the ongoing confrontations around the region. I thought the U.S. was right to try and broker a democratic transition in Egypt, but it failed. And now Egypt is kind of set on a course that almost can't be undone. Turkey is going in the same direction. It's almost impossible for the U.S. to do anything right now to change the trajectory that Turkey is on, even though we can see the disaster that's unfolding. Syria is not going to be put back together anytime soon, whether the war ends or not. And millions of refugees dispersed around the region and increasingly globally, they're going to be not only suffering unbelievably, but also they're going to be a force for instability and extremism in the days to come. And so I don't really see any prospect for the Middle East to go on a better path. I think that decisive choices were made in places like Egypt or Syria that there's almost no going back from. But that doesn't mean the U.S. can walk away from it. We have to try and deal with the symptoms, try and nurture this rising generation, try and deal with the refugee problem, and try and check the worst excesses. But I think that the days of the U.S. being able to decisively shape the region for the better are largely gone.
Well, on that sad and very pessimistic note, I want to thank you for being with us today. You have a lecture to deliver in about half an hour, so I don't want to keep you any longer. Thanks again.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Thanks.